In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about one of the stories that I've done which has delved into Rajasthan's finances to figure out whether the Ashok Gehlot government is actually ruining the finances of the state or not. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and let's get on with it. So now, ever since the Ashok Gehlot-led government in Rajasthan began announcing freebies on LPG and electricity, it has attracted strong criticism from the BJP leaders who said that these schemes would hurt the finances of the poll-bound state. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also spoken in the past quite strongly about what he called Revdi culture, or the practice of some states to attract votes by offering subsidies. However, an analysis of Rajasthan's finances, comparing it to other states and also comparing it to its own history, shows that it's on a relatively strong footing and that its fiscal health has actually improved under Ashok Gehlot. Now let's go over the major findings one by one, and let's start with the fiscal deficit, which is a measure of how much the state's expenditure exceeds its revenue. That is it spending way more than its means? Now, not only has Rajasthan's fiscal deficit been falling, it has recently been falling faster than the average for all states. During the pandemic year of 2020-21, Rajasthan's fiscal deficit as a percentage of its gross domestic product spiked to 5.9% from 3.8% in the previous year, which is a 2.1 percentage point increase in just 1 year. Now, this was a higher jump than the average for all states. On average, for all states, the fiscal deficit rose by 1.5 percentage points during the pandemic year, which is compared to the 2.1 percentage point jump which we saw in Rajasthan. Since then, however, Rajasthan has done well to bring its fiscal deficit back under control. As per the latest data available, the state has estimated its fiscal deficit to be 4% of its GSDP in 2022-23 as compared to 3.4% average for all states. That means that Rajasthan has managed to reduce its fiscal deficit by 1.9 percentage points in the 2 years since the pandemic, compared to just 0.6 percentage points reduction for all states on average. Now, it's also worth noting that the fiscal deficit grew by 0.8 percentage points during the rule of BJP's Vasundhara Raje from 2013-14 to 2018-19, as compared to a somewhat lower growth so far under Gehlot. Now, let's come to the revenues. Rajasthan's receipts as a percentage of its GSDP have been higher than the average for all states over the last decade, and recently that gap has widened. Rajasthan's revenue receipts, which is the money it earns through instruments like taxation, were mostly flat as a percentage of GSDP under Vasundhara Raje. Under Gehlot, the revenue receipts saw a more stark change, first dropping during the pandemic and then mounting a robust recovery for the subsequent 2 years. Notably, the state has also become more financially independent. That is, its own tax revenues and its own non-tax revenues, which is the money it earns with no help from the central government, have both been higher than the average for all states and have both been rising recently. An increasing share of own revenues, both tax and non-tax, means that Rajasthan is increasingly becoming independent of the center. This is in contrast to many states that have said that they have become more dependent on the center since the implementation of GST. Tax revenues for Rajasthan make up about 70% of its total revenues, and so let's dive into that. Tax revenue is also divided into own tax revenue, which is the tax revenue a state earns from the taxes it levies itself, and the state's share in central taxes, which the center then transfers to the state. What is notable is that the share of own taxes as a proportion of Rajasthan's total tax revenue decreased under Vasundhara Raje from 66% to 62% over her term as Chief Minister, only to rise again under Gehlot to 67% in 22-23. In other words, Rajasthan became more dependent on tax devolution from the center under Vasundhara Raje and became more independent under Gehlot. Diving even deeper, analysis found that Rajasthan's own tax revenue has benefited from the implementation of GST. That is, since GST, taxes on the sale of goods and services have formed a higher share in the state's own tax revenue. Now, This is a better position to be in than to be dependent on other internal sources of tax revenue, such as tax on electricity or on motor vehicles, since taxes like GST are more broad-based and apply across almost all goods and services. Now, let's come to the expenditure side, or what the Rajasthan government is spending its money on. The data for Rajasthan clearly shows the state government's spending priorities. The overall expenditure on health, education, and other social sectors has been higher than the average for all states. What's notable is that the latest data shows that the spending on health and education as a share of total expenditure has been the highest in 10 years. That said, the data also shows that Rajasthan's expenditure on capital creation has consistently lagged behind the average for all states. Budgeted at 14.6% of aggregate expenditure in 2022-23, Rajasthan's capex is still significantly below the average of 19.1% for all states, although it's still the highest for Rajasthan over the last 7 years. Looking over time, however, the data shows that the Gehlot government has managed to reverse a largely declining trend in the state's capex. The capital expenditure was 18.1% of aggregate expenditure in 2013-14, which fell to 11.8% in 2018-19 when Gehlot took over. Since then, it has risen, except for during the pandemic, to 14.6% in 2022-23. The other area where the Gehlot government falls below average is regarding the amount of money that the state spends on subsidies as a proportion of its revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure is largely to do with salaries, pensions, and other expenditure that needs to be made on a recurring basis. A larger share of subsidies in this is typically seen as being an increase in unproductive expenditure. Now, available data on subsidies shows that Rajasthan was able to reduce its subsidy expenditure from nearly 13% of revenue expenditure in 2018-19 to 8.3% in 2020-21. During the same period, the subsidy spending by states on average rose from 7.1% to 10.1%. After the pandemic, however, we see a kind of reversal. The data shows that Rajasthan's subsidy expenditure increased to 10.5% in 2021-22, while on average states were able to reduce theirs to 9.7%. Now, there's considerable debate among economists over which strategy is better. Should states prioritize capital expenditure, or should they prioritize things like health, education, and easing the plight of people through subsidies? What economists do seem to agree on is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Each state must decide its own priorities according to its own needs and resources. That said, if the question is, has the Ashok Gehlot government destroyed Rajasthan's finances through freebies? The answer seems to be no. And in fact, the finances seem to have become stronger under Gehlot. Now that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching.